Good morning and maybe afternoon for some of you. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Nicole Floyd Smith, Vice President of Advocacy and Communications at the State Collaborative on Reforming Education, otherwise known as SCORE, and it's my honor to welcome you to this webinar. We're thrilled to have you with us and grateful to be joined today by so many fabulous leaders. For those who may be newer to our work, SCORE is a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and advocacy organization. Our mission is to transform Tennessee education so that all students can succeed in the classroom, career, and life. We were founded 17 years ago by our host today, Senator Bill Frist, who as a physician understood from the start that education is one of the most powerful determinants of long-term health and well-being. Committed to our mission, we advance student-centered policies and practices, support and equip effective leaders, and pilot innovative programs that expand opportunity and improve outcomes for students from kindergarten to career. At SCORE, we know that what happens inside the classroom doesn't happen in isolation. The well-being of students, their health, their environment, the world around them, all of it shapes their ability to learn and succeed. That's why we created our Connecting the Dots event series, to explore topics that sit just beyond SCORE's core priorities, but are deeply connected to student success. Last fall, we hosted Connecting the Dots, the environment's impact on student success, an in-person event which brought together hundreds of leaders in the education, business, environmental, government, and community spaces for a full day of conversation in Nashville. This spring, we continued the series with Connecting the Dots, Education, Conservation, and the Future of Southern Appalachia. It was a virtual conversation about how Tennessee is opening pathways for students in conservation and environmental science. Today's webinar is a direct continuation of the great conversations that were sparked at those events. So today, we turn our attention to a challenge that is reshaping the school day across Tennessee and the country: extreme weather. Record heat, flooding, and poor air quality are affecting student health, attendance, and learning. And it's forcing districts to make hard calls about closures, dismissals, and facilities. We'll begin with opening remarks from SCORE's founder and board chair and global board chair of the Nature Conservancy, Senator Bill Frist. We'll then move to a fireside chat between Senator Frist and Laura Schifter, senior fellow at This is Planet Ed at the Aspen Institute. You'll also have the opportunity to hear from 3 additional experts at the intersection of education, health, and the environment through a panel discussion. It is now my great privilege to turn things over to our host, Senator Bill Frist.
Nicole, thank you. And thanks to all of our panelists for being with us today. This is our third discussion, as Nicole mentioned, convened by SCORE, exploring this impact of our surrounding environment on student success. Stories from our first convening at a symposium nearly almost a year ago still stay alive with me today. Our keynote speaker then, Dr. Lisa Patel, a Stanford pediatrician who leads the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, shared with me right before she took the stage that she'd spent the previous 24 hours triaging infants in the NICU, the Neonatal Intensive Care Unit, who were struggling to breathe in response to heavy wildfire smoke in the Bay Area. Another speaker, Sewanee student Grace Olson, shared how the 2008 Kingston fossil plant failure shaped her understanding of environmental health. The largest industrial spill in U.S. history released toxic coal ash across 300 acres, contaminating waterways and forcing her Kingston, Tennessee community to rely on bottled water for years. Today, our students are going back to school in unseasonably hot weather. July was the hottest month ever on record in the contiguous United States, eclipsing records set in July 1936 when our country struggled with the effects of the Dust Bowl. And Tennessee was not spared. This month's heat index values climbed past 105 degrees all across the state. Polk County schools dismissed students at noon 2 days in a row because of dangerous heat, and an elementary school in Hamilton County moved to virtual learning. Many schools have adapted by canceling outdoor recess, while school sports and athletics programs have taken a patchwork approach of canceling practices, moving game times, and increasing water breaks. As a doctor, I see all this through the lens of health. I first was moved to FoundScore over 15 years ago because the data made crystal clear that education was one of the biggest indicators of long-term health and well-being. Each year spent in school or university lowers your mortality risk by roughly 2%, with college graduates living an average of nearly 11 years longer than those who never finish high school. Today, we're continuing to follow the data. Research shows 1 degree hotter school year lowers academic achievement by close to 1% of the expected gains. And when weather disrupts our places of learning, each week of school closure can set students back 2 to 3 weeks in progress. And heat is not our only disruption. Across the Southeast, the amount of rain falling during the heaviest storms has surged nearly 30% since 1958. Tennessee has felt that from the 2010 Nashville flood, now a little over 15 years ago, the schools were closed for a week with Hurricane Helene reaching all the way inland to East Tennessee. All of these underscore the importance of focusing on other severe weather conditions, unstable weather conditions, which hit us. Unfortunately, these aren't isolated incidents. With 1 in 4 U.S. public schools located in high-risk zones for extreme weather, the changing environment is contributing to a pattern that demands different thinking, and that brings us to today. And the effects go way beyond just academics. Prolonged heat exposure contributes to anxiety and to depression among adolescents. And natural disasters are associated with a range of adverse mental health outcomes in children and adolescents, including things like post-traumatic stress, with depression, with anxiety, with behavioral problems. And that's why today's conversation is so very important. So with that, let's get started. I'd like to welcome my friend, Laura Schifter. Laura leads This is Planet Ed at the Aspen Institute and has spent 2 decades at the intersection of education and climate as an educator, as a researcher, and policy advisor. She's the creator of Play It Cool, a campaign helping families and communities protect young athletes from extreme heat, and co-author of Student Schools in Our Climate Moment. Laura, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me here, Senator Frist.
Laura, you've spent nearly 2 decades working across education environment, as I mentioned, an educator, research policy, more recently at the intersection of education and the environment, including This is Planet Ed and your founding of This is Planet Ed. Tell us and share with us what brought you to bring these two threads together, and how has that focus evolved into the work that you're leading today?
Yeah, so I'm sure many folks on this call have been in education for a long time. My work was in education for a long time. And about 8 years ago, if somebody had asked me if I cared about climate and environment, I would have said yes. But I saw it as an issue impacting generations from now, not something impacting us today. And it was work that I thought those people working on, the environment could handle. We had enough problems in education to deal with. That would be somebody else's issue to deal with. But there are 3 days in my life that have fundamentally changed my perspective on who I am. And I don't know if you've had them before in your life, but one day you're somebody, something happens to you on that day, and something shifts and you become somebody else. So the first day that happened for me was in February 2013 when my eldest daughter was born, and I became forever a different person as a mom. Shortly thereafter, actually, in July of that same year, we lost my brother-in-law suddenly. And I learned for the first time what it's like to walk this world with tremendous grief. And fast forward several years later, it was 2018, I was sitting in the basement playing with my three children, and I got news alert after news alert on my phone. We had a decade left to address climate change to avoid the most devastating impacts. And it was in that moment, watching my three kids play in the basement, that everything I had felt about motherhood and grief hit me in that moment. And I realized these misconceptions I had about our environment were wrong. This wasn't somebody else's problem to handle. This was my problem as a mom. And this was an issue that was going to impact my children and all children's lives. And I had to learn more about it, learn what I didn't know, learn new things about how our environment impacts our children's lives, and do something about it. I spent some time trying to figure out exactly what that would be. And I realized after a little while, actually, that the education system and the thing that I knew really well was being impacted by climate change. And there was a lot that I could do bringing my educational expertise to the work of issues on climate and the environment. I spent about a year talking to anyone that would talk to me, including Jonathan, who I know is on this webinar as well, and shaped an initiative that I then launched at the Aspen Institute called This is Planet Ed. And now we work broadly across early childhood, K through 12 education, higher education, children's media, and supporting parents, all in thinking about the ways that our environment is impacting children's lives today and the solutions that we can advance to help them live healthy and resilient lives ahead.
Laura, I shared a lot of numbers in my opening comments, and it's really about real people, real students, real school communities, and many of the stories that you and Jonathan Klein tell in that book, Students, Schools, and Our Climate Moment that you wrote together. What has stayed with you about how extreme weather hazards, like the ones I mentioned, heat and flooding, are affecting students and teachers?
Yeah, so I think what really sticks with me are always the personal stories. The data reinforce what people's real lives are experiencing. And in our book, we profile the experiences of a variety of people, students, education leaders, all who are advancing work in their own communities. And there are two stories in particular that I'd like to mention as it relates to this. One really important thing that I think we've come to realize is these aren't just students that are passively experiencing these things. It's not just these things are happening to students in sort of a vacuum and we can say extreme heat has happened. It's that students are living it and that they are experiencing it. And one student in particular I want to highlight is a young woman named Maya who was grew up in Charleston, South Carolina. And one of the things that she said was she grew accustomed to the fact that at the start of the school year, they would have to evacuate their home every year. And that was something that increasingly happened as she got older. And for the educators on the call, the start of the school year is one where you're really trying to build rapport in your classroom. Teachers are trying to set expectations. You're trying to set, how the school year will go. Well, these disruptions tend to coincide often with the start of that school year. So students are living it. How is that going to impact the way that you're setting classroom expectations? Whether or not a flood comes, if children are, forced to pack up and leave their homes for a period of 2 days, how does that actually impact the environment that you're trying to build? So I think as educators, it's really important for us to think about how the impacts of extreme weather impact the student experience and how we can create supportive systems within that. And the other one I'd like to highlight really quick is a school board member actually in Santa Barbara, California. And she had been pushing the school district in advancing solutions for quite some time and had been met with, no, that's not a priority for us right now. We have a lot of other priorities that we're dealing with. Then the community got hit by wildfires, and then they got hit by mudslides, and there was loss of property and there was loss of lives that Santa Barbara experienced with these mudslides. And that was when the community was able to come together and say, no, actually, we need solar panels with battery storage at our schools so that we have a place for our community to go to in the event of extreme weather. And one of the lessons that I took away from that is this notion that we know these things are happening more often. We know what the risks are. So rather than wait for extreme weather or disasters to occur, this is actually a real opportunity for us to come together and plan for it as school leaders, and plan for it in our communities so that we can build resilience ahead.
No, I love that. And both of those examples are really vivid. Um, Heat. Let's turn to heat specifically. And I love what you recently wrote in Time on the World Cup's hydration breaks and the story about your daughter's lacrosse game continuing through a heat wave while a nearby softball game was canceled. And I guess it brings me to that kind of inconsistency that I know you're hoping to prevent through Play It Cool, your campaign to protect young athletes from extreme heat, and all this tied to the summer's World Cup. And I'm proud to be an ambassador for your initiative there. But what does that inconsistency tell us about how prepared our systems really are, and what parents and coaches and school leaders should be watching for?
Yeah, so our children today are experiencing extreme heat at a level that we didn't experience. Children in Gen Z are 4 times more likely to experience extreme heat days than those in Gen X. And I know I've had this experience myself. I am on the side, I am a volunteer parent coach for my children's rec sports. And it was about a year and a half ago. I was coaching my daughter, a separate daughter's lacrosse game, and one of my players came off the field and started getting sick on the sidelines. And it was an 80-degree day, but it was exceptionally humid, and it was right at the start of the season. And I realized in that moment that I didn't know what to do, and I'm somebody that works on these issues. I know that extreme heat is happening more for kids, but I was not prepared for that moment with that player and how to handle the situation to make sure she stayed safe. Fast forward a couple of months, I get a call from my best friend who spent all afternoon in the hospital with her daughter, who ended up playing soccer and falling short of breath. And none of the coaches on the field knew what was going on with her. They sent her to the hospital. She had tests all afternoon. And it turned out it was heat illness. And the reality is, again, like our children are experiencing these exposures, and there's a lack of consistency on the policies that we apply to how we think about kids are playing outdoors. But there's also a lack of awareness around the steps to take to keep kids safe. And we are seeking to increase consistency on the policies, but every policy is not going to deal with the fact that maybe an 85-degree day, a kid might be more at risk than you think. So actually building public awareness is critically important. And one of the things I always think about is I'm sure a lot of people on this call will know the steps to take if their clothing catches on fire: stop, drop, and roll. And we've done a really good job of building public awareness around that. And yet we're all experiencing this extreme heat, but we don't have the steps to take in a clear way to know what to do in extreme heat. And so with Play It Cool, what we're really working to do is help people understand, speak up. So if you start feeling any of those early signs of heat illness, have a headache, nauseous, dizzy, you speak up, you tell a coach, you tell a friend, you tell an adult around you. Sit out. You've got to normalize actually taking the step to sit out of the game, sit out of playing outside, and actively cool your body down. I know I saw you had an Instagram post about this recently. Cooling your body down doesn't just mean drinking water. Drinking water is really important, but it's actually about taking the steps to cool your body down. Ice packs, like get in the shade, remove unnecessary clothes. And so one of the things that we're really working to do with Play It Cool is increase consistency of people knowing what to do on the field. Parents, coaches, the kids themselves. So whether you're playing on a playground in a rec sports league or whether you're playing high school football, we can all look out for each other and build this awareness as extreme heat is more common.
Well, Laura, first of all, I love the initiative. And, it makes so much common sense, but you have to hear it and you have to have the discussion. And
Yeah.
the way you open up the discussion and invite people to the conversation. It goes to so much about heat, unstable weather patterns, climate change. All the words are important, but it really is that conversation. So thank you for starting it, initiating it. I love the timepiece. And in your, just, I think, really the last 10, 12 minutes or so is a great place to start. And I know a lot of what you have said is going to stay with our audience for a long time and will feed into the remainder of our webinar. Now, I want to bring in three leaders working on this from very different angles in a district that has lived through it, in the research and in the infrastructure and policy that shape what schools can actually do. So at this point, I'd like to welcome our three panelists. Let me briefly introduce them. John English has spent nearly 3 decades serving the students and families of Unicoi County as a math teacher, a principal, and since 2015 as director of schools. He has firsthand experience leading his district through the devastating impact of Hurricane Helene. Dr. Jennifer Vanos is an associate professor in the School of Sustainability of Arizona State University, where she directs the Human Biometeorology Lab and leads the Heat Ready Schools program. She studies how extreme heat affects human health. Jonathan Klein, co-founder and CEO of Undaunted K-12, a national organization that works to ensure every student can attend a school that's safe, that's healthy, that's resilient. As I mentioned before, he is co-author with Laura on a fantastic book I encourage everybody to look at, Students, Schools, and Our Climate Moment. So with that, let's turn to our panel. And John, again, thank everybody for being with us. John, Unicoi County was one of the hardest hit districts in the state during Hurricane Helene. Can you walk us through what that experience was like for your students? And think of things like disruptions to their learning, to their routines, to any sort of sense of normalcy as your school buildings took on roles way beyond what we think of as education for the whole community.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Senator Frist, for having me. I think the greatest challenge that a school superintendent faces is the physical health and safety of their students first and foremost. But when you're making those decisions, also realizing the academic health is being affected as well as mental health, as you mentioned earlier. And even though after COVID and the pandemic, we came out of that better equipped to connect with our students when we can't physically, be in schools. But Helene certainly created some challenges there. And the thing about weather for us, if you've been in Unicoi County and rural communities just like this all over the state, we have a lot of curvy, steep drop-offs, high elevation. So, many times if you wait till the weather hits, you've waited too late. It's a 2-hour turnaround if we're in school to get students home safely. So many times we have to make that decision based off of a forecast that sometimes comes, sometimes doesn't. But fortunately, that morning we had called school off the night before based off the heavy flood forecast. And I'm thankful that we had done that. And it was actually the Friday leading into our fall break. So we were already scheduled to be out the following week. And so we had a little bit of some room there, to get better prepared. I had heard the term flash flood my entire life, but the flash piece of that I had never really seen. But that morning, within about 30 to 40 minutes, we were in some real trouble. And so as far as our students, and you can see the devastation in some of these photos, but the real concern that morning was the safety of our students. The south end of the county got really hit hard, and we were beginning to hear loss of homes, bridges washed out. The interstate was actually broken in half, to that end of the county. Power was out, cell phones were out. So, when we think about connecting with virtual learning, at least in the immediate, that was not an option. That entire end of the county was again just devastated. So we had some hospital staff. Many of you may have seen that image stranded on the roof of our local hospital. And so they immediately began Black Hawks and rescue helicopters, getting them off the roof. And our high school became the place that they brought those folks. And so it was a reunification site. It ended up being a place for displaced families to sleep. We had about 50 to 60 Army cots, Red Cross came in, air mattresses filled our gym. And then the school became a distribution and donation center. You know, people were bringing everything you can imagine, clothes, water, food, you know, the necessities, because knowing that people had lost their homes. So the school became a hub. And, you know, when I think of school systems in rural communities, especially, they are the backbone and hub of the community. So our high school became that. And then our middle school became a command center where the first responders, local law enforcement, volunteers really from all over the region and state were showing up. Our students ended up being okay physically. We didn't lose any students, but we did have several staff and students who lost their home. Sadly, many of our students, elementary, middle, and high, lost parents in the flood. And for many of those, it was a multi-day, multi-week recovery. So one of the effects was our waste water management system had been taken out. So that created some challenges, of course, well beyond the school system. Our local utilities was working really hard, but you know, they told me up front, it's going to be a while. And so you're always thinking about when can we get back in school? But as I was seeing images and hearing more, I knew it was going to be a long haul type of thing. And fortunately, which ended up feeling like a blessing, we actually only missed 3 weeks of school when initially I was being told it could be Thanksgiving before, you know, everything was restored. We literally couldn't physically get to some of our students. So our local road department was taking us on side-by-sides and four-wheelers and three-wheelers and making paths across mountains to get to students because bridges and roadways were washed out. And you know, so that was just a time that had tremendous impact on really our whole community, but our students. You referenced earlier the mental health aspect, and when we can't connect to our students and they can't connect to us, you start thinking about all of the horrible things. Are they eating? Or are they being taken care of? You know, what is their situation? And so many of them, as the days passed, began migrating to our high school. And again, the students who knew that probably their parents weren't coming back, but they hadn't been found yet. So there was that hope. They were gathering at our high school. Fellow students were coming to be with them, coming to help with unloading the tractor and trailers and all the things that were flowing in from all over the country, really.
Yeah.
And so even though we academically couldn't be in classrooms learning, I've always said there was a whole lot of life lessons that our students were learning in those 3 weeks.
Yeah, just listening to you talk about it. And then if you're out for 2 or you said 3 weeks, remember every week that you're out, it takes 2 to 3 weeks, as I said in my opening statement, to sort of catch up where you are. Jennifer, let me turn to you. Associate professor at ASU School of Sustainability, where you lead research on extreme heat and air quality and of course human health as it relates to schools. And I loved visiting your lab in Phoenix, and here I'm getting scanned, as you can see. So I've seen firsthand the caliber of the research coming out of your lab, and congratulations, I loved it. From what you and your team are finding, what is actually happening physiologically when a child's sitting in a hot classroom or breathing poor air? And also add why kids, as you taught me when I was there, why are kids so much more vulnerable than adults around them?
Yeah. Well, thank you, first of all, Senator, for having me here. I'm really excited to talk about this important topic. And yeah, it was so fun to welcome you to our lab and show you some of the ways we collect data. We're really passionate about collecting data in spaces that children spend time, and one of those is playgrounds, for example. But with respect to thinking through the physiology of it, just when any of us are sitting there exposed to extreme heat, our body has these amazing processes to try and cool us off. And that's going to be directing blood flow to the skin and starting to sweat more so that we can evaporate that sweat and cool off. And if we're in those conditions for too long, our body's not going to be able to compensate for the heat load on our body. And so we're going to start to have a rising core temperature. So we never want to have someone exposed to that intensity and duration of heat that's going to start causing a rising core temperature. And long before that even starts, we're starting to feel discomfort and we're starting to feel sticky in a lot of our climates. And those kinds of perceptions definitely are real and affect our ability to work productively. So thinking adults and teachers in the classroom. and especially for students to learn and behave the way they're expected to behave, to learn what they're being taught. And so there are some slight physiological differences in the way in which adults and children thermoregulate, but in general, it's pretty similar. However, there's not many studies on kids less than 10 years old. And so that's a pretty big gap in trying to understand things like whole body sweat rate and the density of sweat glands, which can differ between adults and children. But overall, adults sweat a little bit more, but children lose a little bit more dry heat. So when that air temperature becomes so high that they can't lose that dry heat anymore, which we call convective heat loss, then it becomes very dangerous. So we never really want those conditions to precipitate, especially in the classroom. And then, of course, when we add in that additional heat load from the body, so metabolism when kids are playing, or even an adult getting outside to do some activity, that definitely increases the overall heat burden to the body. And our sweat rate increases, our skin, our blood vessels dilate even more. And we really have to think about how much of that is okay in a way that supports people getting physical activity, but in a safe way. And a lot of our research in our lab is trying to assess that so we can make proper recommendations for physical activity, kind of like Laura was talking about. And the last thing I'll say is I think that we know, and a lot of research shows, that the younger kids are more vulnerable, largely because of their ability to understand what's happening in their body and their access to resources they might need and the agency to get those resources. So it's kind of like, what experiences do they have? What do they know about how heat affects their body? And what can they really do about it? And is somebody really watching out for them? So that's where even kind of the education and training for young kids is still very important. So they know, I'm sweating, I should go drink water. And I think my 4-year-old can tell me that. And I think we can allow kids to have more of that agency when they're feeling that way.
Jennifer, I love it. I love the connection of science and research to our understanding and how it gets incorporated directly to kids so they can participate, as you said, have agency and help us be better stewards of them. Jonathan, I love this sort of storyline we're developing. We've heard about floods, heat, air quality, all connected to the same underlying pattern of extreme weather. And Laura just took us into the stories behind these numbers at the top of the hour that I mentioned, and the things that you both point out in students and schools and our climate moment, which the two of you co-authored. Undaunted K-12, and you really do sit at that intersection of research and the districts who are actually living it every day. Tell us about the data on the scale of impact on the schools, on the students, on the communities across the country, and maybe even what some of the other impacts are on budgets and buildings and operations.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Frist. Well, the data is not good. Increasing extreme weather is really a current and urgent threat to students. This is not a future problem that we're trying to solve. It's happening, right now. Undaunted maintains a map and a database of all of the closures and disruptions from extreme weather across the country on our website. I can drop a link here for folks, where when we see a news article, we put it on the map. And during the 24-25 school year, we found that at least 9 million students across the country had their education, their school days interrupted by extreme weather. That's getting close to 1 in 5, 1 in 6 students. And we're a small nonprofit organization trying to put dots on a map. We are sure that we are undercounting, the impacts nationally of extreme weather. And as you've shared, lost learning time puts students behind. Missing 1 week of school due to extreme weather compounds learning loss for 2 to 3 weeks, and it's even worse for vulnerable student groups. And a major driver of this is that almost half of our K-12 school buildings across the country were built nearly 50 years ago. That's for different temperatures, different weather. We feature a Washington Post article on our website that includes a map of the schools that were built without cooling, without air conditioning, because they were generally closed during hot summer months. And the decision makers thought they didn't need air conditioning or cooling. So Today, fast forward, high heat days are a regular occurrence during the school year. And, our campuses just aren't prepared. 1 in 3 schools across the country need HVAC upgrades, and this is really a national problem. Portland Public Schools, Fairfax County, Virginia, Philadelphia, Wake County, North Carolina, Milwaukee, Detroit, Boston, Cleveland, St. Louis, Denver, Baltimore, Memphis, Shelby County. All of these districts have closed schools in the last couple of years because it was too hot. And in some of those places, we just saw this data from Climate Central. Average fall heat has increased. It's getting close to 4 degrees since 1970. So if a lot of these school buildings were built 50 years ago, Philadelphia, the county that Philadelphia sits in, average fall temperature is up 3.6 degrees. Milwaukee, 3.5 degrees. Boston, 4.1 degrees. St. Louis, 3.5 degrees. So I have a partner and a colleague out here in California, Andrew Yagoyan at 10 Strands. And Andrew makes an analogy that a previous generation of Californians had to make schools safe for children for earthquakes. And she says, on our watch today, we have to make schools safe. And this is a national project for children from extreme weather and extreme heat. So maybe just two quick resources for folks on the call. Last fall, researchers at Sustainable Ed at Brown University published a tool that lets people look up their local school and see the risk levels for different environmental hazards. It uses data from FEMA's risk index to rate a school's vulnerability to heat waves, wildfires, flooding, hurricanes, strong winds, and other hazards. We'll drop a link. And then Undaunted also published a toolkit with 10 strands for district leaders on climate resilience. And, it has tools and stories and case studies around energy and grid resilience, stormwater management and flood mitigation, mitigating extreme heat, protecting from wildfire, stuff like that. So we'll drop that in the chat as well.
Jonathan, yeah, thank you. And it'll be in the chat, and also we'll put it in our show notes as we distribute this broadly as well for our viewers coming in. Jonathan, I love what you do because, when something happens locally to us, we relate to it, but we don't realize it's part of this bigger pattern going on all around the country. And that's why the work you do, I think, is so important, because you see it's not just one city. It's not just like one-off event. And that collectively it causes to action coming on. So thanks for your great work.
Thank you.
So I think, again, in our storyline over this hour, we've done a fantastic job, and thank you for defining where we are today and the problems that we're facing, not just locally, but regionally and around the country. But let's shift towards solutions, and action coming in. Johnny, let me come back to you. What in the world did it take, sort of from the operational standpoint and a financial standpoint, to get students back into those buildings? We said, it was 3 weeks before they were back on track. And then academically, it's probably another 8 or 9 or 10 weeks after that. But talk a little bit about that recovery period for your students.
We had 2 major challenges, when it was time to get back into school. One, our elementary school on the south end of the county, it wasn't a total loss, but it suffered pretty severe damage. So we knew this happened late September. We knew we couldn't go back to school there that year. So during that 3-week period, we were trying to juggle meeting the immediate needs of the community and families, but also trying to plan for when we got the green light that, we could go back to school, we were ready. So we had to physically move our elementary school, Temple Hill, into our middle school. Just knew our buildings and knew that the middle school was the one location we could absorb the K-5 elementary school. So all of a sudden that school became a K-8. But there was a tremendous physical move to that. Everything inside of that school had to be relocated to the middle school. And so, that was a pretty heavy lift at that time while we were juggling, again, the immediate needs. And then the second thing was where the high school and middle school was being used by the community, by first responders. The first responder command center at the middle school, we had folks coming in from the river doing the search, rescue, and recovery, but they were in waters that weren't safe, because the waste management water system had been destroyed. So there was some real concerns of what that river was like, but they were coming back to our middle school to get rest, to eat, to plan. And so when we started thinking about getting back to school, we knew that both the high school and middle school needed some heavy cleaning, like not just your normal custodial janitor cleaning, but some electrostatic, deep disinfecting. So, we were calling companies who did this. Certainly, we had never been through anything like that. So we knew middle school and high school needed a very, very, very deep, high-level cleaning. And that cost totaled over $100,000 for 2 buildings. So that's where our reserve funds came into play. And of course, TEMA and FEMA were there the entire time. There was some reimbursements financially that came later, but in the immediate, there was a lot of cost up front, that the school system absorbed. But, we were able to get through those things, get our buildings safe for our students to return just from a cleanliness standpoint. And, I think as a school leader, we have manuals full of safety plans and different plans, but it wasn't the kind of situation where we could go pull out 1,000-year flood manual, all the things that come with that. So we were really learning on the fly. And then as far as the, getting our students back, as you said, we knew tremendous learning loss. And so our teachers had to plan, and on the back end of our timeout, we were getting our teachers in, and maybe that unit that was scheduled that year to take 5 days now had to be condensed down to 3, because we really, especially at the high school, they're on a semester block. So 3 weeks in a semester was a huge chunk. And, they had EOCs and exams coming up in early December. So there was a lot of crunch, but I will say our staff and students really, really, really went to work. And again, there wasn't a manual for it, but I think just the overall leadership of our school system and the planning that we do certainly came into play there, both academically and non-academically.
Yeah, I think hurricanes coming as far inland is where we are. I just didn't grow up thinking about that sort of thing. So the shared information about what unstable weather patterns are in the broadest sense, and in your case, the unexpected, not unheard of. And again, we're seeing more and more of that today. Jennifer, your Heat Ready Schools program, which you and I talk so much about, I loved, and that study that you co-authored is fantastic. And I love the fact that you laid out recommendations to help schools prepare for and respond to extreme heat. Talk a little bit about that. And I remember you had those 30 recommendations, and pick a few that you might share with us.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm going to throw the link to our website in the chat so people can see more about the Heat Ready Schools program. But we developed this about 6 years ago, and it was created kind of aligning with Heat Ready Cities that was created through the city of Phoenix. And we said Heat Ready Schools are a really big part of a Heat Ready city. And we focus on supporting schools being able to increasingly identify, prepare for, mitigate, track, and respond to the negative impacts of school ground heat. So that's both indoors and outdoors. And it's about, and so as you said, 30 recommendations across 5 themes. And it's about helping schools thrive on hot days instead of just survive a hot day. But it does require some capacity, especially up front, but with support from us. And I would say if I had to pick some of the top recommendations, one of them is training that we're trying to work more on and create. So training for teachers and training for children, so that there is this ability to prevent or recognize and respond to heat illness, like Laura was mentioning before. What do we do in that situation? And a lot of people don't have that training, and it can take 5 to 10 minutes, just some reminders at the start of each heat season. So let's say May and August, for example. And then infrastructure, and I know Jonathan will talk more about this, but air conditioning. We need cooled indoor spaces for kids to be able to learn and for teachers to be able to teach. And if we look at some of the occupational health and safety laws or guidelines in place for indoor work, sometimes I think teachers are not working under proper indoor conditions. And if we can have teachers work under proper thermal conditions, we can have students working under proper thermal conditions. And I think that's important. But the question is, how do we get there? And I know that you and Jonathan have been working on this with some of the kind of air conditioning thought work. And then along with air conditioning, that helps support indoor places to play. And one of the interesting things we found in our most recent work and working across different states, and especially with California, is that Arizona is unique in that we are the only state that actually requires schools to be kept cool to 82 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. Most schools are much cooler than that. And so there's not this worry about indoor learning in the heat, but there is this worry that kids are not getting play, partly because most of our schools don't have gymnasiums the way that schools do in the Midwest and Northeast. And so there's not much ability to play. So another recommendation we have is if you do absolutely have to keep kids indoors, what can they do to get play? Because their readiness to learn is directly affected by their ability to get those wiggles out. And we have research that shows that. And so that's a big kind of recommendation we make, because more screen time does not make them ready to learn. And then two more big ones, I would say. One is just having appropriate outdoor spaces to play. And so we can't just have an open asphalt area without shade. We can have more shade in these highly valuable outdoor spaces for kids to be able to play in. And so we've been doing more work on understanding how do kids play in spaces that have more shade, and what does that mean to the human body when we can shade a kid and then let them go outside and play. And a shaded playground allows kids to play more. And we call this playability, the same idea as our livability approach, saying if a space is shaded, even on a hot day, kids can still go play. That makes these spaces more playable. Last point I'll make is we're noticing in our research, a lot of schools don't have nurses or health aides. They're much more common in Arizona than we're finding in some of our California schools. And we find that really interesting. So where does a child go when they're not feeling well? Is it the front desk staff? And our schools really thinking about this? And are they trained to be able to recognize and respond to those signs of heat illness? Or is it their teacher? And is that their job? And so we talk to a lot of nurses in our Arizona schools that can tell us all about this, but we're not finding that in other schools. So I would say those are some of the levers we can pull right away and try and support schools with.
No, I love that. And when I came back to Phoenix the other day and I saw those playgrounds with those places that you could play shielded from the sun, it really impressed me.
Yeah.
And I saw this morning that it's going to be 115 degrees there in Phoenix today. I don't know what it is yet, but I guess that's pretty standard for you. But 115 degrees right this moment kind of drives it home to me coming in.
Yeah, so no one's going to play in that, but hopefully the kids got to play this morning.
Yes, indeed. Yes, and Jonathan, what about infrastructure? You're on it all the time. The weather challenges that we've heard about today, the federal tax credits, the ground source heat pumps. Go ahead and comment a little bit on this infrastructure and the role that it plays, because most people, even most parents, don't think very much about the infrastructure, but as a community at large and community leaders, we got to focus on it.
Yeah. I mean, my first year teaching was 1997. I was teaching fifth grade, and I know that for most of my career in and around schools, I undervalued the role of facilities and a comfortable place to, a safe and comfortable place to learn. And now as an adult and as a parent, it's been just so kind of eye-opening. And the good news is we do have some tools that can help local leaders. So you mentioned ground source heat pumps. For folks on the call, ground source heat pumps are one of the most cost-effective technologies that school leaders and district leaders can use to heat, cool, and clean the air in buildings. It's one single modern HVAC system. And many schools across the country are still using aging boilers and heating systems, and then often lack cooling. And so ground source heat pumps work differently. They use the stable temperature of the earth to heat buildings in the winter, and then to cool buildings, you put heat back down there in the summer or in the fall on a hot day. And so because they're not burning fossil fuels, they're also not polluting the air, and they contribute to healthier indoor air and outdoor air, frankly, for young people and staff. So the economics are good too. They are often more cost effective. They're one of the most energy efficient technologies, so they are cost effective to run. They have fewer moving parts, so they're often more cost effective to maintain. And through 2034, we have a federal tax credit that will cover generally covers 30 to 50% of the cost of modernizing a school's HVAC system with these ground source heat pump technologies. And we're seeing this, across the country. Denton ISD in Texas to St. Paul Public Schools, Center Grove, Indiana to Prince William County in Virginia, Seattle Public Schools, Metro Nashville, Tennessee. All of these districts are demonstrating that this isn't a pilot or a future idea. It's happening today in diverse geographies and communities. And accessing the credits is relatively straightforward. You may need a professional services firm if you're a district leader to help you do it, but the process is basically you install and place the system into service. You complete a simple kind of pre-filing form with the IRS. Once the system is installed and your tax year is over, you fill out the tax forms, and then you get a check. It's actually a mailed check from the IRS, and districts across the country are getting $800,000 checks, $1.5 million checks. I think that Seattle one was an $8 million check for 3 high schools where they did these projects. And it's really important as we need to use cooling more in our buildings. Energy and utilities is the second largest cost on district budgets. And so we really need to be choosing cost-effective technologies that preserve those, scarce local resources, for teaching and for teaching and learning. So we are working to, help district leaders navigate this process. I dropped the link to all of our resources, case studies, fact sheets, tools that advocates and district leaders can use to kind of get started with their partners in communities to start thinking about, okay, we want to take on cooling, we want to take on modernizing HVAC systems. How do we get started? So happy to follow up offline with anybody that's out there that wants to talk more about what's going on in your community.
Yeah, Jonathan, I love it. And I think for all of our viewers that are with us today, in terms of what we can do, it's really just asking the question. And if you see a superintendent or a school board member or even the teachers, just bring it up, because a lot of people aren't aware of the economic advantage, much less the health advantage coming through. So great job with all that. We're going to finish on time. So let's each take a minute and kind of just go around the horn. And let's focus on maybe what each of you think as we look ahead at the bigger picture. And if we're really serious about ensuring student success as these weather conditions get more extreme, what is a next good step that we might take? We can't cover them all here because we got just a minute apiece. But think of the education community as a society, as individuals. What do they mean to students? So with that, John English, you want to take a crack at that coming in?
Sure. Yeah. I just think
only a minute.
Yes, sir. The balance between the physical health and the academic health. And I think as long as you have power and those types of things, then being able to connect virtually, while it's not the same as in-person learning, is something that we continue to grow and become better at. You don't want to have to go to that virtual learning, but it is a nice tool that we didn't have pre-pandemic. It wasn't in our tool belt to be able to access and keep kids engaged while they're out of the building. But I think for us in the education community, that's something that we keep trying to strengthen.
Yeah. Yeah. And from learning lessons from the past, how we do that. It takes continued discussion, but it's just that. And so much of what we're talking about is get this conversation going, this connecting the dots between our environment and the world around us and the world that's within us coming in. Yes, Jennifer, what about it?
Yeah, I love this question. And I could say so many things. I'm going to say that, one, I can't tell you how much I've learned from talking to kids at the schools, teachers and parents, the people who are working at schools who are affected by this on the ground. It can't go unsaid that their experiences really matter. And then that shifts the way in which we study this, that in a way that can actually support the resources and capacity building they need. And what I'm noticing, like in our research in our group, is that capacity is really lacking for even a school to try and take on something like being a heat ready school, because that initial activation energy has to be there. In school, they're kind of saying, no, we don't have the time for this. And our goal is to show them that this will save them time and make their days easier. But I think those there's a big lack of resources and capacity, both personal resources and financial resources. So I hope that some of this work that we're doing and these conversations can support all of that.
I love it. I love listening to the students coming
Mm-hmm.
in. So fundamental, so easy to kind of skip through that and say we've got the answers, but I love going to the students. Jonathan Klein, what about it?
I just a very basic thing is for everybody on the call or the webinar today, it's like go have one conversation with another person in your community. Find a friend. We are all living through this, and asking the questions about their experience of the extreme weather, and find an ally, that wants to work on it with you. I think that's just it's a lot easier when you have collaborators like Laura or Jennifer or John or you, Senator Frist, kind of fellow travelers in this work. They are everywhere, and we need to be more organized. And then I also think there's a lot, and I'll drop a couple links that if you can talk to state leaders, like that ground source heat pump tax credit, it works. Local leaders can access it directly, and there's so much that smart state leaders could be doing to promote and align state resources to help districts do this. A big barrier is the upfront costs. A lot of the funding for school comes locally, and so we need more states to get in the game and really think generationally about like both the impact over the long term. We need to make 30 and 50-year decisions about these buildings, and we need to choose cost-effective modern technologies to best support health and learning for students. And then I'll just say, really co-signing on some of the things that Jennifer talked about around just funding for planning, funding for teachers and school staff to just understand, what to do. And there's a new heat policy agenda out from the Federation of American Scientists that we're supporting, which has more ideas, but can be another tool for local leaders and advocates to kind of get handles on these issues.
Well, I wish we had one more hour because I'm learning so much, but really appreciate it. And as I mentioned to everybody, that we're going to make this available to people at our website. I really do want to thank John, you, and Jennifer, and Jonathan, and Laura Schifter for sharing all of your knowledge and experience with our viewers. It's rare to be able to have this sort of conversation, even limited within an hour, with the richness and the vast experience that you have, really, as I said at the opening, coming at it from three different sectors. To people who are able to tune in today, I want to thank you for taking your time out of your busy schedules to join us today. And I do encourage everyone to do what Jonathan just said, and that is to talk, to have this conversation. I encourage each of you to reflect on what you've heard today. Maybe if you've learned a few things, to think about the story. So much of it is storytelling, the sort of stories that stick with you and paint the nuance, but also give the factual substance and gravitas to what we're on, and to share it with others. And literally, kind of what I just heard is in the next hour, talk to somebody about this conversation. The recording for this webinar will be up on the SCORE's website soon, and we'll make it easy to send it via email, and we can send it to anyone who's unable to join us. So please feel within your own groups to share that. Sort of the why behind all this is that we come together to do something like this today because we all, in our own way, care deeply about the success and the well-being of our youth. I look at a lot of things through health and well-being because I'm a doctor coming out. Of course, I am. But I have personally 9 grandchildren, all under the age of 12. They all kind of came in one big bunch. And I do think about the classrooms where they sit every day right now as we speak. And then the playgrounds that we talked about today, where they play. And I think about the air that they're breathing in every day over the course of that day. And I want them and this whole generation to spend their days in a world that gives them every chance to learn and to grow and to have healthier and more fulfilling lives. And I think about the world that they're going to inherit if we don't act, which is our call to action. I synthesize all this when I think about it. It really comes down to kind of one sentence, and it's that the world around us shapes the health and well-being within us. And it's so basic. And that's what gives me great hope for our future. And that is the amazing group of individuals that we all heard from today. Each one of you, our panelists and presenters who are working to create healthier places of education, of learning, of community, and all of you tuning in who care so deeply about this issue and will bring all these learnings home to your own communities. My only closing words are the words of the American anthropologist Margaret Mead, who famously said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." Thank all of you for being with us. Have a great day and spread the word.